Some protagonists in the field of artistic research make a plea that the language for artistic research ought to be formulated in a manner such that the language remains intrinsic to art practice. An example that comes to mind is the artists' group Art and Language that began to associate during the mid-1960s at Coventry College of Art in England and took as a point of initial inquiry the language use of the Art Society. The group was founded in Coventry, England by Michael Baldwin, David Bainbridge, Terry Atkinson, and Harold Hurrell. The critic and art historian Charles Harrison and the artist Mel Ramsden both became associated with the group in 1970. They were constantly in the quest for viable means of making art, not just visible, but transformative. This group was one of the early proponents of conceptual art, and their international collaborations in art and language's name provided alternatives to existing approaches to art through arguments, digressions, journals, artworks, nonsensical lapses, videos, or musical projects that brought even antagonistic voices together. Personally, I continue to attempt recording aesthetic encounters with the overlapping or colliding slippages and deviations between texts, memories, oral architecture, ecological sounds, rhythms, scientific research, and my own metaphorical or allegorical processes of investigating their energies. I got drawn into this journey when I found myself tangled in the web of science, innovation, and technology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As an open source researcher, I was able to interact, play with, and navigate findings which in turn got activated in my imagination as a design, a sound work, or a lyrical narrative, or even a fragmented story. All of this manifested itself through a 5-year-long project titled A Square and a Half, The Colors of Sounding, which consists of a well-researched journal and 20 sung lyrical narratives. Through this project, I have attempted to sift through a new visual language driven towards expressing the starkness of the inner world of human consciousness in relation to scientific research, references, or connotations. Such an assemblage has involved disintegration or transfusion of ideas through intuitive tools which helped me integrate logical thoughts and structures with the most intimate feelings, dreams, and experiences. From plasma sculptures to making silk purses from sow's ears, from materials to the material, from vision to sound, the grim vocabulary of scientific discoveries and technologies has ever since been spitting magical vowels and consonants, half observed and half recognized. If we try and understand the language of artistic research in a purely deterministic way, as precise and one-dimensional, then the manner with which I experimented in this project with its leaning towards the spontaneous and the ludic would be considered radical. The layers and layers of meaning, interpretations, ambiguities, and displacements of thought, image, sound, and text endlessly reorganize themselves, and art becomes artistic research through multiple processes of inquiring, notating, conceptualizing, emoting, performing, sounding, thinking, sensing, and feeling. When I look at a scientific research or a concept, I become alive to its symbolic meanings. The colors, shapes, metaphors associated with the ideas beg for articulation. At first, there is a vacuum of sensations arising from perceived or imperceptible findings. Slowly, the activated process of acknowledging the existence of the original concrete forms reveals the dynamic shapes and forms that guides me to recognize and focus on the possibilities of the various transfusions or transfigurations. When multidimensional sensibilities are at play, the boundaries between the inner and the outer worlds melt, dissolving space, time, disciplines, and subtly blending and contrasting the visible and the not so visible, and thus creating a tangible dream screen where all our inquiries help us experience a return to the womb. When we fuse our consciousness into this womb of existence, all the surface fragmentations between form and formlessness disappear, and different modalities of drawing, performing, choreographing, designing, or writing acquire aesthetic coherence. Isolated empty cues and features of a scientific concept, as they appear to an artistic mind or a literary mind, shift orientations, and suddenly we seek to disclose or eliminate surface thinking through abstract creative mechanisms. And these visual, spatial, kinesthetic, or verbal expressions reveal new pathways of understanding. A beautiful instance is found in the works of New York City-based interdisciplinary artist Sarah Ellen Egan. Sarah is inspired by technology, fashion, and the intersection of art and science, and her work explores interpersonal relationships in the 21st century, where intimacy is often replaced with immediacy. One of her works, Anatomy of Desire, uses the vocabulary of the human anatomy to explore psychological states by focusing on the violent side of the desires to connect and the tensions present within the act of longing. Her work compels the viewer to come to intimate terms with one's own vulnerability. In a frame of contrast, I recall Edward Munch's work, Summer Night's Dream, or The Voice, which beautifully portrays the first awakening of adolescent sexual desires. The backdrop is possibly Norway's Borre forest, and it provides a silent yet powerful landscape for the muffled feelings of desires that blur her form. Munch himself said in a related text, "Standing like this, and my eyes looking into your large eyes, in the pale moonlight, do you know? Then fine hands tie invisible threads, which are wound around my heart, leading from my eyes, through your large dark eyes, into your heart. Your eyes are so large now, they are so close to me, they are like large dark skies." Artistic research can be expressed through making figurative choices and operating to bring the inexpressible through various non-verbal ways, using metaphors, allegorical devices, imagery, digital technology, dance, sounds, materials, etc. We can remap our lives constantly in a manner so we can think, act, and manifest our deepest desires, even through articulating the experience of silence. Words come from silence, from an awareness of space around us. When we intertwine these silent desires from within and without with our own mind, body, memory, and experience, a rapid and unbroken outpouring of expressions are formed. These could be in the form of photography, music, theatrical performances, dance, and so on and so forth. Just emblematic inscriptions of our artistic investigations that yearn to find an embodied form and record the fabric of our interests or findings. Let us now talk about sounds or vibrations and deep listening or seeing as a source to the language of creative research. The vibratory quality of sound can be experienced as visual, palpable, and audible. Novelist Virginia Woolf's Three Pictures is a cautionary tale that details three scenes and does not suggest anything about orality. Yet a heightened sonic experience is illustrated through its symbolic language that does not include the presence of sound waves. In the middle of the night, a loud cry rang through the village. Then there was a sound of something scuffling and then dead silence. All that could be seen out of the window was a branch of lilac tree hanging motionless and ponderous across the road. It was a hot, still night. There was no moon. The cry made everything seem ominous. Who had cried? Why had she cried? One lay in the dark, listening intently. It had been merely a voice. There was nothing to connect with it. No picture of any sort came to interpret it, to make it intelligible to the mind. Woolf's musico-literary endeavors disclose the relationship between orality and spatiality, and she empowers the reader's eyes through transparent visual or photographic mediums that suggest the transference of the other senses. Her experimental visual metaphors help us listen or even touch her words, opening new approaches towards our sensorial and affective level of awareness. Her method does not involve artistic methods of data gathering or analysis. Rather, she insists that her readers find themselves in the arc of the creative process of thinking, knowing, feeling. Waves in Glass is a series by father-son duo from MIT, Martin and Eric Demain, who work and teach at the intersection of mathematics, computer science, and art. Each piece in the Wave series is a hand-blown glass hollowhead containing a hand-folded piece of paper with curved creases. The project is about the unspoken communication between paper and glass. The glass was initially made while blindfold, leaving touch the only way to communicate with the material through a thin layer of wet paper. The Demains combine the art of origami and the science of geometric folding algorithms to create the aesthetic of their sculptures. The constant communication between art and mathematics was the guiding force in these creations, which also examine the fundamental truth of how artists communicate with material, how paper relies on touch, how materials respond as folds form the shapes. Glass blowers, says Martin Demain, rely on visual cues to communicate and shape this amorphous material. In order to make it relate with paper folding, we blow glass blindfold, leaving touch as the only way to communicate. Touch is possible through a thin layer of wet paper, which serves as the communication interface between the artist and the material. This experiment brought a new sensitivity and awareness in communication with the glass and between paper and glass. After the experience, we returned to making glass while sighted and found that our perception changed and the physical sensation was heightened while we continued to shape the hot glass through wet paper. He goes on to explain how they chose a head shape for the glass to hold the paper, as it embodies most forms of human communication: vision, voice, hearing, and smell. He says, as scientists, we are concerned with how to best communicate new discoveries and processes. We use sculpture as a way to express our research to a broad audience, illustrating the beauty of mathematical structures through the design of physical manifestations. We find that the dialogue between our scientific work and our artistic work inspires both our art and science in directions that would not be possible in isolation. Inspired by their extraordinary forms in hyperbolic spaces, I wrote a non-traditional libretto, possibly for a very short operatic performance. The setting was the caves at Skotjang in Slovenia, where the river Riva springs from below the Snežnik Plateau and flows some 55 kilometers on the surface. The surreal story is about the phantasmagorical, passionate love between male and female ohms, which are translucent fish-like white amphibians who are blind and have heightened senses and use their choreographic language of the bodies to communicate via their senses, via chemicals. Through insect symphonies and a magical world of fanning and beating ohm tails, where stalactites serenade them and seahorses sing of never knowing desire, the story moves from caves to the river and ultimately ends in an abstract galaxy of shapes and sounds. The ending is open to interpretation, where the search through fused shapes and colors is an amplified, or stretched perspective, as one might use in photography or to create a photo montage. The visual perspectives do not correspond with the sonic, and the quest for a structural order creates a tension that makes for a language that is complex, conflicting, and dissonant, yet inching towards harmony, and paradoxically, the need to be understood. Waves in glass had a visual vibration and rhythm that registered in my mind beneath the register of visibility. It was almost a tactile gesture whose vibrations could be seen and felt at the same time. The language of artistic research could be conceived as a similar, spontaneous flow of empathetic connections made during our endeavors to identify our shifts in awareness. What do we mean when we talk about a vocabulary beyond conventions? Transferring traces of information from a variety of disciplines and translating or transforming them, or allowing them to merge freely with each other, or even dissolving the original findings to transgress boldly into something completely unthought of, has been one of the ways I have found my vocabulary. The language of artistic research could be one where even the domain of gestures could supplement, complement, or even substitute spoken communication. For instance, when American aeronautical engineer and painter Frank Molina started to think about a method that would enable him to achieve fluent contact of light and movement to better apply his imagination, a completely new kinetic system resulted from his experiments and considerations, which he named Luminine. The Luminance System paintings, which are modulated light via mechanical filtering, projected surreal color and light intensities, and though the basic composition remained unchanged, the outlines playfully interacted. The language of waters and streams, of wind-blown waves on the sea, of our own perception of space and time, is embodied in Molina's works that almost speak the same language gesturally as Dylan Thomas would in many of his poems. One such poem that comes to mind is "Light breaks when no sun shines." As the poet envisions the world as an extension of the human body, he says, "Light breaks on secret lots, on tips of thought, where thoughts smell in the rain, where logics die, the secret of the soil grows through the eye, and blood jumps in the sun." The poet shows concern for man as he records his inner struggle from spiritual darkness towards some measure of light. The merging images of light and darkness, life and death, illustrate the basic trope of the poem. The language of darkness and light is a powerful tool in building visual imagery, and in order to develop this discipline in kinetic ways, Molina equated thought and concept with electricity and space. When we think in terms of research infrastructure, the language is unique because this is how Molina is able to articulate and create extraordinary tangible insights about his own artistic practices and interdisciplinary research. Designer and educator Muriel Cooper, founder member of the MIT Media Lab and co-founder of the Visual Language Workshop, charted new territories in graphic design, and her artistic research on photos, sketches, prints, books, videos, laser discs, etc. was also layered with her deep interest and research in artificial intelligence, cybernetics, and so on. Her language for artistic research was her ability to correlate facts, figures, and practices across disciplines, and to manipulate the directionality and temporality of reading to create a non-narrative experience of simultaneity. Her visual language was talking images, and thus American architect Richard Worman said of mural, "I believe mural has wings, wings that create the wind of change, wings to fly towards new visions." One of my dear artist friends, Japanese artist Yuji Kurata, combines photography, paper, wire, clay to create sculptural forms of the human body with the prime intent of depicting his personal traumas, his sense of alienation, and fragmented moments of despair. When I asked him what stories he's trying to tell, he said he was only trying to show the boundary between reality and fiction, and for that, words were not necessary. I believe that one of the key factors in the expression of artistic research is to give into an unmediated connection between the body and the surroundings, to the vibrations that can direct us to our aesthetic inquiry in a very substantial manner. An investigation of the sensation of light through sounds, of our sense of touch through our spatial sensibilities has played a huge role in how I direct the language of my artistic research. Then we come to think about how we represent artistic research through poetic and choreographic transcriptions. I have been working for a few years with Dr. Lars Schüttger, German zoologist, ecologist, ethnologist, and founder of the Chitka Lab at the Queen Mary University of London, and absorbing bee research, especially sensory motor learning and its relevance for tasks specialization in bumblebees, and sharing my experiential approach towards creating soundscapes and writing narratives based off his research. Having worked across various other disciplines, particularly during my project, A Square and a Half, The Colors Are Sounding, I always had this latent desire to merge or connect ecological vibrations, sounds, experiences to choreography, abstract visuals or video art, illustrations, poetry, and even the voice, to unfold the science art research, thus stimulating the imagination and the sensations in a dynamic way. I'm drawn towards the stream of consciousness technique, which was propagated by Marcel Proust, Virginia Woolf, and James Joyce, to name a few early exponents. The language of artistic research, I cannot imagine it changing science or the study of cultures or many other disciplines from art. So the research becomes a live space with fluctuating densities of sounds and thought as we freely narrate the subconscious as fluidly as a bird in flight. The stream of consciousness is an open field perception which allows human beings to express themselves as part of the woven fabric of existence. The intertwining of reality, of associations, continuity, confusion, and fragmentation allows the narrative language to be truthful and compelling. Very recently, I read a research paper about how male crickets produce sound by tegmental stridulation and often use specialized wing areas as primary resonators. It is also generally the male that produces acoustic mating signals by stridulating their forewings, whereas the mostly silent female receives the song and performs phonotactic movements towards the center. Another article described that the courtship song of the cricket plays an important role in inducing the female to mount the male, which is necessary for mating. The song consists of a short amplitude modulated chirp, followed by a long trill of constant intensity and high syllable rate. They have a repertoire that includes 3 structurally distinct songs termed calling, courtship, and aggression song respectively. The 3 songs serve distinct functions. Calling song serves to attract females from afar. Courtship song induces the female to mount the male. An aggression song is produced during aggressive encounters with other males. Furthermore, the experiments indicate that the two necessary acoustic parameters for an effective courtship song are the fundamental frequency, which is 4.5 kHz, and the temporal pattern of the chirp. Thus began my new exploration of listening to the crickets around my home and at various parts of the MIT campus where I live. I was constantly in the quest of spontaneously allowing the vibrations of the trills, chirp patterns of cricket songs to guide me in the quest of finding myself, my imaginative space, and the interaction between sound, space, hearing, landscape, memories, and metaphors. I was led by spins of grappling rhythms, mastering impulses, tracing patterns as it were, in a dark universe. The universe that focuses on the collective impact of all sounds emanating from natural biological origins. Much like the female crickets who are listening for love, I was hypersensitized to the vibrations of cricket songs. In some form of forgetting and remembering, I was thinking of how Auguste Rodin dealt with the contrasting aspects of light and shadow, of weight and lightness, of repose and motion. Rodin's sculptures articulate desires that issue from a realm somewhere between cognizance and unconsciousness. Rodin was always fascinated by the never-ending possibilities of shape, muscular shapes and curvatures, and the ever-elusive expressiveness in the dancer's moving form. I was also recalling French symbolist painter Audelaire Reynaud's Elastic Phantom, as I was likening the female cricket listening, tuning into the sensual calling of the male cricket, focusing symbolically on the language of flux. As we focus on the tactile presence of the canvas, the woman's body, there is still the aura enigmatic, despite the nude voluptuous body, and the one step forward onto the bed, the light and the shade. The sinuous lines suggest something that goes just beyond the naked eye. It begs for interpretation. In some way, this is reminiscent of the fluidity in Rodin's sculptures, who captured movement and form through the paradoxical approaches of luminosity and obscurity. Yet there was something lacking in the process of abstracting the corporeal in the choreography. With his virtuoso modeling skills, Rodin managed to convey the softness of a woman's belly, her arched back, and even the weight of her breasts. His sculptures radiate sensuality and eroticism and movement. The sensual malleability is undeniable and reminds me of the quivering anatomical details found in the sculptures at the Khajuraho temple in India, the only difference being that the Khajuraho imagery is far more explicit than the guarded, implicit abandonment in Rodin's female forms. Involuntarily, I was also reminiscing the dance form that I had been trained in years ago, Odissi. Odissi is a dance form that originates from the east coast of India, which is studded with sculptured caves and temples. It is a sculpturous dance form in which the head, bust, and torso move in soft, flowing movements, creating sensual, emotional, and spiritual allegories all along the way. In Odissi, the face is never in stasis. The smile, the eyebrow raise, the constant eye motion, and the moving lips are some of the emphasized features of the face. The choreography tends to morph, repeat, multiply, and break the linearity of the narrative and create patterns and rhythmic variations of percussive accompaniment. The rhythmic vocabulary is transmitted through the individual footwork, gestures, moods, embodied expressions, and narrative localization. The purpose being to braid intrinsic patterns of text, sculpture, sensuality, ritualization, and spiritual aesthetics, rampant with visual references. At this point in time, I'm keenly exploring variable mechanisms by which I can transfuse my individual experience of tuning into the cricket songs, the oral stimulation received from the chirp patterns, the dynamics of neural activity in the female cricket, and its response to the sound patterns. I'm making connections between the mind, the body, and sieving through a rich cascade of metaphorical images. I seek for the dynamism and fluidity in these metaphors that help me blend concepts, memories, and thoughts effortlessly. In the wake of my imagination, I reflect on the sensory world of the crickets. Imagination and metaphorical space-making is a way of elaborating the initial recognition of ideas and associations that have triggered the imagination in the first place. I also imagine the drawing procedure that interacts playfully with the little dotted lines of the half-formed narratives that lie scattered in my subconscious mind. The calling energetics of the insect world is alive now with story, a manner of expressivity that expresses my artistic interpretation of cricket songs, mating, aggressive behavior, temporal signal patterns, and variable intervals of silence. I remember lines from Vladimir Nabokov's poem In Paradise. Where is the world and the labeled roses, the museum and the stuffed birds? And you look and look through your tears at those unnameable wings. Through the dream you sing, I listen. Sometime between infinity and this instant, we speak low in the shadowland of desire. I wear you, you tingle in me. Together we chase the impossible, inaudible orbs of our wings. This our teasing fire. The canvas of my body is a sound you can touch and read. My eyes on the grass clouds when distance breaks into reality. Yet again your speaking wings find my silence in the last traces of the summer wind. Your calls drench dead leaves, and your wings become birds and drip with lilies. We taste the splendors of the infinite, tracing slowly this geometry of experience. The lilies become me. The lilies become me. The lilies become me. The tangled wood was full of sound. The forest screamed. The forest groaned with fear to see the spearman beast his spear. And then in that field of fire, the darkness, the ire, the storm of the languishing bodies left to weep, in the wingless death of desires, the fate of man, the fate of all life, your sounds forever buried beneath roots of trees, the last laugh of flowers. Our unsoundings have meaning. The universe keeps repeating motifs of what was once the real thing. The sculptor is at work. Your tune will remain on stone for them to touch. Sleep now in forever peace. This grass remembers our love in this field of fire. Professor Arup Chakraborty, the founding director of MIT's Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, recently discussed how the regulation of genes have played a critical role in maintaining cell identity. He described how synergistic physics-based computation and cellular experiments showed that liquid-like droplets comprised of transcriptional molecules form on DNA to regulate transcription of these genes. He compared these droplets to dewdrops on a blade of grass and theorized on the therapeutic relevance of these liquid-like active forms of nuclear matter.
Buddhist monk Ihe Dogen used the imagery of a dewdrop reflecting moonlight to describe the state of meditation. He suggested that just as the entire moon is reflected on the dewdrop, similarly, a complete awakening of the truth could be experienced by a human being. He said, "Nothing is hindered when the entire moon and the entire sky abide in the 33 kinds of bodies, or in dewdrops on the grass. The depth of the drop is the height of the moon." In another context, I remember the Aztec paradise described by Louis Burkhardt, where sounds and metallic colors come into being through a metallurgical process, and a new sacred paradise is created, filled with shimmering beings, insects, feathers of birds, and reflective dewdrops. Once again, I recall the words of Virginia Woolf, who said, "The eye is not a miner, not a diver, not a seeker after buried treasure. It floats us smoothly down a stream, resting, pausing. The brain sleeps, perhaps, as it looks." Languages manipulated by storytellers in the representational arts have their own literary and pictorial codes and conventions. For instance, the manner in which legendary filmmaker Satyajit Ray visualized his films was possibly directed by his first encounter with Nobel laureate and myriad-minded mystical poet, writer, and storyteller Rabindranath Tagore, when Ray was just 6 years old. Tagore wrote the most profound lines in Bengali in Ray's notebook, which translates as, "I travelled miles for many a year, spent riches in lands afar. I've gone to see the mountains, the oceans I've been to view, but I haven't seen with these eyes what 2 steps from my home lies. On a sheaf of paddy grain, a glistening drop of dew." From Professor Chakraborty's "Dewdrops on a Blade of Grass" to Dogen's imagery of the dewdrop to describe the state of meditation, to Louis Burkhardt's reflective dewdrops in a sacred paradise, and then to Tagore's metaphysical glistening drop of dew on a sheaf of paddy grain, I try and examine my own response to what shapes the language of my creative thinking. I wonder if my language of reflective creative research proceeds through a series of representations that are constructed from the flow of visual imagination or information, or is my aesthetic approach beyond tools and devices and possibly more reliant on a natural dynamic relationship between retrieved memory from a visual stimulus that goes on to weave complex transformational metaphors from specific data through a lot of mind wandering or sifting possibilities, chasing my memory constancy through unorganized fluid impulses and finding order by transforming half-remembered voices of the past by the spatial sensations of the present stimulates me the most and helps me believe in the language that integrates my creative muse. Now at the Institute is seen the Futurity Island by Yediminaz and Nomeda Urbanaz, which is conceptualized as a space for acoustic experimentation. It serves as an infrastructure that hosts sound compositions and performances that open space for learning. A network of pipes becomes an artificial skeleton that employs sound to channel the voice of nature. It somehow reminds me of the sense of understanding the coalescence of silence and speech in Samuel Beckett's theatre. Beckett's art rests on the thin invisible line between the spoken and the unspeakable, the known and the unknowable. There is this continuous quest to employ words whilst seeking silence, where eloquence and logic are disjointed and wandering in estrangement. Is this what we can possibly call the translation of awareness, the language of artistic research?